I find myself surprised sometimes when I find ancient customs have remarkable parallels with customs in our own time. There is a reason why that is true. You can take as an illustration or an analogy, perhaps, the existence of language. All languages have nouns, verbs, adverbs, adjectives, and prepositions, and possibly some other stuff as well. We have to have those to communicate, to be able to put together meaningful ideas and to convey them to one another. Not only that, but these nouns, verbs, and stuff have to be organized into sentences according to some systematic syntax. Why? Well, the logic of communication demands it. And this is also what makes translation possible. When you go from one language to another, you look for the nouns, the verbs, the adverbs, the adjectives. And even though maybe the order is different, for example, in our language, we have a kind of a noun, a subject, verb, predicate order. In other languages, everything in the sentence goes in ahead of the verb, and the verb is tacked on at the very end. And so it is with language. Now, take this idea a step further into contract law. A contract is a covenant, and it comes into existence in two major forms. Scholars recognize that both the covenant grant and the covenant treaty, two different kinds of covenant. In modern contract law, there are some long-standing principles that resemble some things in the Bible. And again, I think the reason is because logic demands it. If you're going to be able to function legally in a society, you have to expect certain things of your neighbor, and you have to provide certain things to him anytime you're going to try to put something together. I remember hearing in real estate law that every man's word should be his bond, but in Texas, if you don't have it in writing, you don't have it. So you've got to put it down in writing. And I also learned that a valid contract has to have certain things, or it's not a valid contract. For example, it has to have a date. It has to have the signatures. It has to have, of course, the subject, whatever it is you're transferring in terms of property. And it also has to have some consideration in order to be a valid contract. The consideration usually in real estate deals is money, but it could be any number of other things if you wanted to do it that way. Which is why it says consideration rather than money. Parties to a real estate sale have to be present at the signing of the final deed of covenant. In other words, there are ways, because of difficulties some people have, of working your way around this with specific powers of attorney. But generally speaking, it is required. You've got to go down there. Some buyers and sellers don't like each other very much. And so they arrange that they do their closings at different times, but they still have got to go down to the title place and sign the deed on the dotted line and either give or receive their consideration. It's been a long time since I've studied this, but these principles are there in contract law. Now I want to take you back to what may well be the biggest real estate deal in the history of mankind, and how it has really monumental proportions. It also has some of the same principles. This is one that scholars would call a covenant grant. It's the oldest known example of the formalizing of a covenant. It's not the oldest known example of a covenant. Noah's covenant is earlier than this, but there's no, as far as I can recall, no formalizing of that covenant in terms of ceremony or anything of the sort. This one occurs some years after Abraham, following God's call, left his home and his father's house and settled in Canaan. On this occasion, Abram sees a vision in which the word of God came to him with encouraging words. He said, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield and your exceeding great reward." Now, Abram was a man of great faith. And he actually left his home, his household, his family, and everybody else and went to a place he'd never been before strictly because God told him to go. And that required a great deal of faith. You'll find this all in Genesis, the 15th chapter. Abraham's reply is surprising in its candor with God. I don't know that I would have quite been so bold, but then he was a friend of God and he could. "Lord God," said Abram, "what will you give me, seeing I go childless, and the heir of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus? Look, you have given me no offspring. A man that was born in my house is my heir." His frustration's apparent. Abraham's an old man. His household is substantial. He has no one to carry on his responsibilities. You know, somebody's got to take care of his wife. Somebody's really got to provide jobs, as it were, for all this multitude of servants and take care of the cattle. You know, you don't just feel like dying and letting all this stuff go to rot. Somebody needs to take care of it. And he says, basically, the only person I've got to do this job is a household steward. God answered, no, this will not be your heir. One who comes from your own body shall be your heir. So God then took him outside. I guess it was night. And he said, look now toward heaven. Count the stars and see if you can number them. So shall your descendants be. We don't really get a chance to see what Abram saw. Not often. Because there is so much light pollution in our world that it just isn't there for us to see. But on those rare occasions, and I can remember distinctly, when I was a boy, we still had not quite gotten so bad. And on my grandfather's farm, which was out of town and away from all that light pollution, a summer night could be absolutely dazzling with the stars in the night sky. So he took him out on that kind of a night. And he says, look up there. Count them. Go ahead. Count them if you want to. Your seed are going to be like that in number. This time, Abram asked no questions. He simply believed what God told him, even though he had no idea how it could be so. He said, okay. Then the Genesis account has this memorable statement in verse 6. He believed in the Lord and he counted it to him for righteousness. And it goes down in history as a great statement. Paul brings it up later on. Abraham believed God and he counted it to him for righteousness. But God wasn't finished. He went on, I am the Lord that brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to possess it. Now, if you're Abraham in this situation, you may immediately, and probably would, wonder, what do you mean by this land? Do you mean what I can see with my eyes where we are right now, that mountain over there, and that set of mountains over there, this plain? And really, to him, at that time of life, was really quite a lot. He said, this land? What do you mean? And he asked, Lord God, how shall I know that I will inherit it? The inheritance of what's going to be a monstrous tract of land is going to need some verification, something like a deed of trust perhaps. So I think the thrust of his question is this: how shall I be certain what it is that I will inherit? Because he already believed God that he was going to have all this, but now he says, how am I going to know this? At this point, God asked for him to bring some sacrificial animals. We'll call this the consideration that has to come with any type of a contract or a covenant. During the next day, Abram brought them. He cut them in two pieces and placed the pieces opposite one another, and he sat down with them to keep the vultures off of the carcasses through the remainder of that day. Then at sundown, he fell into a deep sleep, and a thick, frightening darkness came over Abraham at that time. Then God spoke. Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. They will serve them. They will afflict them for 400 years. Also, the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward, they will come out with great possessions. Now, as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, but the fourth generation shall come back here, because the iniquities of the Amorites is not yet complete. Now, the Amorites were one of the principal inhabitants of this land. And basically, they had to completely disqualify themselves from possession. And so God says, we're going to go it'll be 400 years. By that time, the Amorites will have gone so far that they will be irredeemable, and we will then drive them out of the land. Then Abraham saw a burning torch that passed between those pieces. It was on this day that God made a covenant with Abraham. Now, this is what he said. Mind you, the smoking torch going between those pieces is God passing between, symbolically, this sacrifice, accepting this sacrifice. And here comes his statement. To your descendants have I given this land from the river of Egypt, that's the Nile, to the great river Euphrates, that's the one that runs through Baghdad, The Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, Amorites, the Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. I'm giving you all of it. From the Nile River to the Euphrates River to Abraham's descendant. You see what I mean by being the biggest real estate deal in history? Nothing like that's ever been transpired since. And this is the deed to Palestine and the surrounding lands passed to Abraham and his descendants. And it really is amazing to see the scope of that deed. The land promised to Abram, who's, by the way, later called Abraham, which all of you know, encompassed every square foot of ground between the Nile and the Euphrates. You know, all that up the Mediterranean coast, all of what is today Syria, most of what is today called Iraq, and so on, including the Arabian Peninsula where all that oil is. It was land currently occupied by 10 tribes that would eventually be dispossessed. Now, there are a couple of things I think are important to note in this account. One is the word covenant, Hebrew, berith, which comes from the root of the verb to cut. And I'm fascinated, I've not traced the etymology of the expression, that even to this day we speak of cutting a deal with somebody. And I can't but think it has its origins going that far back. For I see no other reason why we would cut a deal instead of make a deal. And indeed, the word covenant means deal. I think everywhere you see the word in the Bible, if you put the word deal in there, it makes perfect sense. In ancient Semitic cultures, a covenant involved cutting oneself, giving some of your blood to the other person to drink, which created a new blood relationship. We're familiar with the American Indians' tradition of blood brotherhood by the mingling of their blood, cutting themselves, mingling their blood together, and creating a new relationship where a relationship did not exist before. It's a really old custom. In the course of time, this was changed to the blood of a sacrificial animal or the eating of a sacrificial meal. Jacob and Esau, I believe, had a sacrificial meal at one point in making a point as to where their boundaries were going to be. This may also, by the way, underlie the command to the Israelites to drink no blood of an animal, but to pour it on the ground. They had a covenant. They didn't need to be making any more blood covenants with anybody else ever, and the drinking of the blood of an animal was sometimes involved with the blood covenant. In this case, Abraham cut animals into two parts, and God walked between them to meet Abraham in covenant. Now, this also requires contract law, resembles contract law, in that the contracting parties must be present. You know, you can't make a distant contract. You got to go down to the title office and sign the deed. Well, God met Abraham. He was physically present and signed this deed, as it were, made this promise, entered into this covenant grant with Abraham to grant him this property. Another thing to know about this covenant is that it's familial. That is, it applies to one man and all of his family, all of his descendants over time. I've always said it's a covenant grant. The covenant grant, which one scholar said is modeled on the free royal decree, which I think it's the other way around, is an unconditional divine gift and is usually understood to be irrevocable. And I think that is true of this particular one. Another example is the covenant with Noah. There's no ceremonial confirmation of this covenant, but it is also a covenant grant. Scholars distinguish between two major kinds of covenant. I mentioned this earlier. This one is the covenant grant. The other is the covenant treaty, in which two parties agree on what the covenant is going to be. Abraham and Isaac both, for example, made covenants with a man named Abimelech regarding wells that they dug, which you can read through here and you suddenly realize, wow, water was just as important back then as it is today. And they were ready to fight wars over who owned a well or not. But rather than fight the war, they got together with Abimelech, they talked it over, negotiated, and entered into a covenant treaty with Abimelech on these particular wells. Now, what we call the Old Covenant is a kind of covenant treaty, but it differs from the ordinary in a very important respect. It applies to a people, to a society, rather than to individuals or families. It is a social covenant, and it's far better called the Israelite covenant than it is the Old Covenant, because it only becomes old later on. At this point, it's brand new, this new covenant with God and with Israel. So it applies to a society. The Israelite covenant, and this is was something I don't think I had quite got a grip on until recently. The Israelite covenant resembles what is today called a social contract. And that resemblance may prove to be instructive for us. In the 17th and 18th centuries, philosophers were beginning to develop what came to be called social contract theory. Rousseau, Hobbes, and others were beginning to advance explanations, philosophical explanations, as to how it is that societies organize themselves, were able to live together, to coalesce, and govern themselves in whatever way it was they did. This is called social contract theory. A social contract was said to be this. I'm going to read it to you, so you may want to listen carefully. And a social contract is an implicit agreement within a state regarding the rights and responsibilities of the state and its citizens, or more generally, a similar concord between a group and its members, or between individuals. All members within a society are assumed to agree to the terms of the social contract by their choice to stay within the society without violating the contract. I'm going to read that again because it's extremely important. All members within a society are assumed to agree to the terms of the social contract by their choice to stay within the society without violating the contract. Such a violation would signify a problematic attempt to return to a state of nature. Now, state of nature, I think Rousseau invented that particular expression. It basically is a synonym for anarchy. I think a true state of nature was relatively rare in man's history. They always managed to organize themselves according to some social contract, even if they were outlaws. Men, desiring the society of other men and of family, found it easy to find an implicit social contract with others. It was a kind of informal covenant. In other words, it formed rather than being formed, and it didn't have a particular moment in time when it was ratified. If you don't like the terms of the deal, you can leave the society. Don't live there. Go somewhere else. Part of Abraham's covenant with God was circumcision. He was the beginning of a society that included family and more. And this is something that's easy to overlook if you're not a careful reader. It included family and everyone living within his leadership as a patriarch. Not just his family. This was not merely a matter of DNA. This was a matter of who's in charge here. God said to Abraham, Genesis 17, verse 9, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout all your generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male child shall be circumcised." So circumcision was a token of the relationship that he had established with God. And it applied not merely to his own children, but to every male child born in his house. That is to say, everyone who would live within the scope of Abraham's control and governance. You don't want to be circumcised, you probably better move over the next mountain, because everybody who is under Abraham's governance is. He goes on to say, "He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised. Every male child in your generations, he who is born in your house or bought with money from a foreigner who is not your descendant. He who is born in your house, he who is bought with money, will be circumcised." Didn't make any difference. Whether your DNA was Abraham's or somebody else's, if you're going to live in this house, and by house, it means within the scope of government. That's the way the term is used in the Bible. This is the house of Abraham. It includes everything that he controls. He says, "My covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. The uncircumcised male child who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." What does that mean? Cut off from his people. I mean killed? No. Exiled. He is not allowed to be a part of this covenant. It is important to understand this, because it is a recurring theme. You will find it again and again. The man that doesn't do this should be cut off. The man that does this should be cut off from his people. And it occurs repeatedly in the law having to do with certain things. And the point is just simply this. If you reject the social contract, you can't live within the benefits of the social contract. You can't enjoy our society. You can't enjoy our protection. You can't inherit the land that has been promised to us. You and your descendants are outcasts from this society. The man who breaks covenant with God will be cut off. It is, in a way, a play on words, by the way, with the term circumcision, which also means to cut off. So that there is the circumcision, the cutting off, which, in a way, cuts you in on the deal. If you're not willing to live under the circumstances of the deal, you're cut off and cut out. It means also, as I said, to be cut off from the social contract. Now, this called to mind when I was studying this, a really important document from American history that I had never read. I have heard about it all my life. I had never read it. It's the Mayflower Compact. Now, all of us, I think, at least we used to. Now, I don't know who knows what they're teaching in schools these days. But this was one of the most fundamental founding documents of the American colonies, and it was, many people consider it to be really a part of the foundational idea of the Constitution of the United States. But the Mayflower Compact, I won't ask for a show of hands to who's read it and who's not read it, but I hadn't until I came across it this week. When the Pilgrims arrived in a new world, the thing that they realized was a lot of colonies had come before them and a lot of colonies had failed. And they saw very clearly that the reason why these other colonies had failed was because of a lack of government. So, the Mayflower Compact is in essence a social contract in which the settlers consented to follow the rules and regulations of the government for the sake of survival. The government in return would derive its power from the consent of the governed. Have you heard that one before? That is one of the oldest principles of the American democracy, that the government derives its power from the consent of the people who are governed. Now, when you think about the narrow means of survival for the members of the Plymouth colony, and there's a pretty good chance this week that you've heard some of that in the little blurbs that go back and forth on television and people mentioning Thanksgiving and all that happened around Thanksgiving. When you understand what a close-run thing it was for these people not to have either starved to death, as people did in Jamestown, or to have lost their lives to Indian wars or whatever, as others did, then you might understand more deeply what it means to be cut off from the social contract, where you no longer have a right to the protection, you no longer have a right to come inside the fort, you no longer have, basically you are exiled from all the benefits that would accrue to the social contract because you're not willing to bear the responsibilities that go with being a part of the social contract. For any Israelite in the wilderness, being cut off from his people would make it extremely difficult for him to survive. Easy to see if you take a good hard look at the desert in which he was going to be crossing in this period of time. Still more, it would mean being disinherited, cut off from inheriting the land. You would have no right at all to be among those for whom the land was parceled out by lot for inheritance in generations to come once Israel came in. If you're cut off from your people, you are disinherited from this particular thing. The Mayflower Compact is a fascinating document. In case you didn't encounter it in school, I'm going to read it to you for your consideration, and you'll never be able to say you don't know what's in it again. Here it goes. In the name of God, Amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign, Lord King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King and Defender of the faith, having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. Catch that? You know where they were? Cape Cod. Do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. Notice the word covenant. This is a compact. It's a covenant. It's a deal. It's an agreement, a social contract, as it were, for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof, we have hereunder subscribed our names at Cape Cod, ye 11 of November, in the year of the regime of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, and Ireland, ye 18th, and of Scotland the 54th, year 1620. November 11th, 1620. I was really struck that, remembering from King Henry V about the wars to be sure that France was a part of his dominion, King James was also king of France. Now, the word covenant is very strong in here, and this is in a very real sense the Mayflower Covenant. They established a simple, one-paragraph agreement for establishing majoritarian governance for their group. Now, they were a small group. The complications of larger governances that would require the Constitution later were not a problem for them at this point. They did not develop a Bill of Rights which would protect minorities, and didn't have that much in the way of minorities. The whole thing was everybody signed this document. They all became a part of the social contract. And as a result of it, they promised over their signatures that whenever the majority passed a law, they would submit to that law and go forward with it. So they promised to enact laws as necessary, to submit and obey all such laws as once they were enacted. And this is a classic example of a social contract. Now, from Cape Cod, let's take ourselves back in time to the foot of Mount Sinai, where a different kind of social contract was enacted, but which also really did amount to a social contract. And I don't really think this is, I don't think I've ever heard any of the religious discussions and arguments and bickerings and what have you and debates on the subject of the Old Covenant, New Covenant. I don't think any of them have ever really focused on the fact that what we call the Old Covenant was the Israelite covenant, and it was a social contract. Some 3 months after leaving Egypt, the Israelites arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai. Moses went up the mountain to speak with God, and here God lays out the covenant deal and its objective. Exodus 19, verse 5. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, you will be a special treasure to me above all people. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. End of quotation. These are the words God says you speak to the children of Israel. So there's the deal. It is a classic if-then statement which makes it a covenant treaty, not a covenant grant. You got to meet certain conditions. Whereas with Abraham, he didn't have to meet any conditions. Whatever there were had already been met. And so that land was granted to him. In this case, the people have to agree to this, just like the settlers, at Cape Cod had to agree to the Mayflower contract. So, Moses came in and called for the elders of the people and laid before them all those words that the Lord commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. So Moses brought back the words of the people to God. Now you realize what you've just heard? You have now heard the terms of the social contract that Israel was going to make with God. If you will obey me, then I'll make you my special treasure. I own everything, and so forth. Israel says, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. Pretty all-encompassing, isn't it? Now, you might take note, by the way, of who it was that Moses called. He called the elders. Now, we take words like that for granted. We just, assume we know what we're talking about when we hear it. But when you see that word elders, what you should begin to realize is that there was a previously existing social contract. It was familial. In other words, it's the kind of a contract that grows up in a society where it is understood that the old man over here calls the shots for our family. He is the elder. And in the family of Manassites, there was a gentleman who actually called the shots for whatever it was Manassite was going to do. He was their judge. He was the guy they took problems to. These elders that existed in Israel actually were the heads of an existing social contract which was implicit. It had never been made explicit. As far as we know, it never formalized. It was something that grew up and has grown up in all manner of places around this world of ours, from the South Pacific to Africa to you name it, where tribalism exists, that the old man of the tribe, he's the ruler. He's in charge. Now, they represent, as I said, an existing social contract that was familial, tribal. So the deal is proposed and accepted on behalf of all Israel by the elders. It's even simpler than the Mayflower Compact, which I wouldn't have thought was possible, but it is. God says, you do what I say, you'll be a special people, I own everything, you'll be really my special treasure. The people said, whatever you say, we'll do it. And so they went. Now the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to, this as contracts, it must be signed, or at least confirmed by a handshake. This covenant also had to be formally ratified. So the next step in the process followed. The Lord said to Moses, behold, I come to you in a thick cloud, so the people may hear when I speak with you and believe you forever. Now, don't just think that this is intended as an endorsement of Moses. You know, I'm going to come down a big thick cloud on the mountain and I'm going to speak to you, Moses, and all the people from here on out are going to know that you're my special guy. No, that's not really all that's involved here. It's important because in order to ratify this covenant, God had to be present. Just as with Abraham, you don't make long-distance covenants. You come down, you pass the burning torch between these pieces symbolically. God says, I'm here. And this is the deal. Now he tells Moses, get the people together. I'm going to come down on top of this mountain because they have got to hear me speak. So, Moses told the words of the people to the Lord. So he said to Moses, go down to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes, be ready against the third day. For on the third day, the Lord will come down upon Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Now, I didn't actually get to see him because when he hit the mountain, so much smoke and everything's around, you just know he's there. And they're going to know he's there from more than the smoke before he's done. It was necessary that God come, that both parties to the deal had to be physically present, and it was necessary that the people, not just Moses, hear the voice of God pronouncing this deal. So, to begin to enter into the covenant, God came down on the mountain in front of the people, covered by a thick cloud. The people got themselves all ready for this. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God. And we are at this point in, Exodus 19, verse 17. Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was completely in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. And when the blast of the trumpet sounded long and became louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him by voice. Then the Lord came down on Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain and called Moses up, and up Moses went. Now steps had been taken to ensure that neither the people or the priests were allowed to come too near. There was danger for the enormous power of the place that was there. Even Moses, when he came back, had his face glowing from the exposure to whatever power it was that was there. Only Moses and Aaron were ever allowed to go up that mountain. Then God spoke the 10 Commandments. You find them beginning in Exodus 20, verse 1, which are the foundation of all the laws to follow. Now there's every indication here that all the people heard him speak the 10 Commandments as he had those words roll down the side of the mountain. But the power, the emotion of the moment were really too much for them. And I can easily understand that. I mean, there are things that happen from time to time that you can actually feel in your abdomen because of the emotion and the power of a given moment in time. I have a feeling that a lot of knees just gave out, and people were flat on their face on the ground as a result of the incredible fear of the earthquake, the sound of that trumpet that just kept on getting louder, and then the voice of God rolling down that mountainside. Well, it tells us all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, the mountain smoking. When the people saw it, they trembled, stood way off. And they said to Moses, "You speak to us and we'll hear. Don't let God speak to us or we'll die." This was not just fearfulness. This was a very real human response to an experience that no other human being had ever had, nor ever would have again. Moses said to the people, "Don't be afraid. God has come to test you, that his fear may be before you, that you do not sin." So the people stood afar off, and Moses drew near the thick darkness where God was. And the Lord said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, you have seen that I have talked to you from heaven." Now this was crucial. It would not have been the same if Moses had gone up the mountain and come back and said, "Well, I saw the Lord up there and he told me this." It just would not have been the same. Because in this case, the covenant required the parties to the covenant both to be present. In the future, Moses would go up there and do that. But this is the moment of covenant, and the people had a right to have God present and to hear his voice because of the demands that he was going to make upon them. And I can only imagine how shaken they were by the experience. Now, what follows is also important. They had heard words from God. They were not given this revelation in pictures or images. They were not allowed to see what God looked like. There is a strict prohibition of any form of image. God would always speak through his word, not through images. It has always been thus. It always will be. And so when Jesus Christ comes on the scene, he is the Word of God. Then God hands down in chapters 21, 22, and 23 judgments on issues that were current. Now, I think this is important for you to understand. That whole segment begins, these are the judgments of God. The other 10 were 10 commandments of God. These are judgments. Now, judgments are decisions that are rendered in cases that come before a judge. They are rendered in circumstances where there are questions about how exactly the law might apply. I think that 21, 22, and 23 of Exodus are judgments handed down for the time, for the place, under these circumstances. This is what we are going to do. Now, I don't mean to imply by that these judgments passed away at the cross, or they could be tossed out, or no attention paid to them. I don't mean that at all. What I do mean to say, though, is that they are a light to your feet and a lamp to your path for the decisions that are yet to come. They are precedents in law, and therefore they are not done away with and will never be done away with if you can accept Jesus' word on this. Now, after Moses gets all this from God, he takes it to the people. So Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments, which I think had a lot to do with stuff going on right then and there. And all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words which the Lord has said we will do." And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. And he rose in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. So, we have a verbal agreement to a social contract. Note also that there is no oral law involved in this. Moses wrote down all the words of God. He doesn't have it that he wrote down some of them and memorized the rest. He wrote them all down. We have them right there in the book. He put up this altar. Now he continues in verse 5. He sent young men of the children of Israel who offered burnt offerings, sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. Consideration. Moses took half the blood, put it in basins, half the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant, read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has said we will do and be obedient. Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you according to all these words. So as I said, it isn't immediately obvious, but in a sense you have similar things. You have people there to enter into the agreement. You have the agreement itself. You have the promise. We know about when the date was. It was apparently on the 6th of Sivan on the Hebrew calendar when the Ten Commandments were uttered at this point. We have a consideration in terms of sacrifices that were offered, and the parties are present when the deal is made, which is kind of fascinating to me to go back and look and see what it is that we have. Now, as I said, this is the moment of the formalizing. It is a blood covenant, and it was confirmed by the shedding of blood. It isn't the old covenant. How could it possibly be the old covenant? It's just been made, right? Okay. It isn't the Mosaic covenant either. It's not a covenant between Israel and Moses. It's the Israelite covenant with God. That's what it is. So what exactly is the covenant? It's true that the Ten Commandments were included. It's true that the judgments of Exodus 21 and 23 are included. But they are not the covenant. This is a mistake that is commonly made by people. They say, well, the Ten Commandments equals the covenant. They got a proof text here or a proof text there taken out of context that suggests that to them. But they're not. The covenant, I just read to you. It is the agreement between God and Israel concerning the covenant. I mean, if you and I agree that I'm going to sell you a piece of land over here, and we get together, we write out a contract for all the land, and we sign, seal it, deliver it, and so forth, and you take possession of it, the land has not gone away, has it? If our contract is broken, does the land go away? No. Does Texas law regarding what we do in broken contracts go away? No, it doesn't. The contract is the agreement. The old covenant, which we like to call it, is the agreement, not the law. It's an agreement to obey the law. Now, remember, again, this is a covenant treaty. It has two parties. And here is the covenant. God. Now, therefore, if you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be a special treasure to me above all people. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The people. All the words which the Lord has said we will do. And these weren't the last words, by the way, that God was going to say. Those words also became a part of the deal, because the deal included all of his commandments. Now, God said, if you'll obey my voice, that included what he had said and what he would say from now on. Sadly, Israel broke the covenant with God. Now, let me ask you a question. Did you hear, in all my reading in here today, anything at all in this passage about it being a marriage? No. Marriage, as an analog to this, an analogy to this, is developed by the prophets later on. Write this down in your memory, as it were. It's an analogy to the covenant. This is not a real marriage. Marriage is another covenant of the same kind, and by analogy it is compared to this particular one. So, literally, it is what we have just read. As I said, this is not called the Old Covenant. So how did that happen? Well, it happened because of something Jeremiah said. In Jeremiah chapter 31:31. 31:31, you should be able to remember that. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not according to the covenant I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they broke, though I was a husband to them, says the Lord. Now, when he said, I will make a new covenant, Paul in Hebrews tells us, he made the first one old. That is how this, and by the way, I think there is only one place in the entire Bible, if you search for the words Old Covenant, only one place you'll find it. It's in the New Testament. Otherwise, you don't find Old Covenant anywhere in the book. It's something we have taken to be very, very important. But anyway, as he goes on to say, this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days. I will put my law in their inward parts, write it in their hearts, and will be a God to them, and they shall be my people. Now, you got to ask the question at this point, what's happening, with the law question? Well, the only thing different with the new covenant from the old covenant is in the old covenant, the law was in tables of stone. In the new covenant, it's in your heart. Which law? Same law. Same law, precisely. One of the natural questions, as I've already mentioned, isn't the Ten Commandments part of the Old Covenant? Wouldn't it pass away when the Old Covenant passed? No, and no. It wasn't part of it. It wouldn't pass away when the Old Covenant passed. If it did, hey, as a Christian, steal all you want. Here is Jesus' word, and this is the word we live by. Matthew 5, verse 17. Think not I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. Now, how in the world do you think people who heard him say that understood that, what it to mean? The term law and the prophets to them meant first 5 books of the Old Testament and the rest. Don't think that I'm going to do that. Then he goes on to say, I have not come to destroy but to fulfill. Verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, not one stroke of a pen, not one mark on the page shall pass from the law till all has been fulfilled. And by fulfilled, a different word, he means that everything has been accomplished. There are 2 things. Heaven and earth got to pass, and everything's got to be finished. Then can one jot or tittle pass from the law. And what he establishes by that is we're talking written law, not oral. And if he had meant that the oral law was as permanent as written law, there's right here is where he would have said so. But what about those judgments? Aren't some of them outdated? Well, yes and no. Judgments do not always require literal obedience. They are there to inform us in making future judgments. They serve as precedents. It is up to us in good faith to ask the question, I don't see the situation I face in the Old Testament. What is there that I see in the law, the statutes, the judgments, that can inform me as to the will of God and how I should make this decision? This is how many of the laws in the Old Testament can be applied in the modern world, and the only way they can. Because I can assure you, based upon what I know about modern law, is you really will get in a whole lot of trouble if you try selling your daughter, which could be done in the laws that were passed down in Exodus. The Ten Commandments, though, are another matter altogether. These things are not merely there to kind of inform you that it's a good idea not to steal. They are there to tell you, don't do it. They are hard commandments of God. They aren't going to go away. And Christians, as much as any Jew who ever lived, are expected to obey them. There's a lot more about this, but it'll have to wait for the book.